Previously, on the Astor mansion that started a war. Caroline Astor fled her home at 34th Street, driven away by her nephew William Waldorf's hotel, the Waldorf, which had filled her world with noise, strangers, and commerce. At 65th Street, she built a new palace. A French Renaissance chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt. A ballroom that could hold the 400 once again, a fortress against change. And society followed her. Dozens of millionaire families abandoned the old neighborhood and built their own palaces along Fifth Avenue's new Millionaires' Row. Caroline had led the great migration north. She'd proven her power. She'd escaped defeat. Or had she? Because in leading society to this new avenue, Caroline had also unleashed forces she couldn't control. A new generation, a new kind of wealth, a new America that didn't care about Dutch bloodlines or whose grandmother knew whose grandmother. And time was no one's ally. Caroline Astor was in her 70s now, still hosting her annual ball, still receiving guests, still signing her name Mrs. Astor without need for clarification. But the world around her was changing, and even queens must eventually face the truth that every dynasty, no matter how powerful, has an ending. This is that ending, and what came after. When Mrs. Astor moved to 65th Street in 1895, she started a stampede. Not immediately, not overnight. But within a few years, the message was clear. If you wanted to matter in New York society, you needed to follow Mrs. Astor uptown. Think about the social calculus here. You're a wealthy family in the 1890s. You've spent years, maybe decades, trying to get into Mrs. Astor's good graces. You've attended the right parties, dressed appropriately, married your children wisely. You've finally made it into the 400. And now, Mrs. Astor has moved 30 blocks north. What do? Stay in your comfortable brownstone downtown, even though downtown is becoming commercial? Or do you follow her, build a new mansion, and ensure you remain in her orbit? For most families, it wasn't even a question. Between 1895 and 1910, Fifth Avenue, north of 51st Street, transformed from a semi-developed residential area into the most exclusive address in America. The Vanderbilts came. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built his chateau at 58th Street, the largest private home in Manhattan, occupying an entire city block. William K. Vanderbilt had his mansion at 52nd Street. The Vanderbilt family alone claimed multiple properties along this stretch of Fifth Avenue. The Carnegies came. Andrew Carnegie built his massive Georgian mansion at 91st Street, much further north than Mrs. Astor, but still part of the same migration. When the richest industrialist in the world moved uptown, it sent a signal. This was where the future lived. The Fricks came. Henry Clay Frick, the steel and coke magnate, built his palazzo at 75th Street. Today, it's the Frick Collection, one of Manhattan's great art museums. But in 1914, when it was completed, it was a family home, and a statement of Frick's arrival in New York's social elite. Dozens of other families, names like Whitney, Gould, Havemeyer, Duke, Schwab, followed the same path. They hired the same architects, Richard Morris Hunt, Stanford White, Carrère and Hastings. They built in the same styles, French Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, Georgian, Beaux-Arts. Let me give you a sense of scale here. In 1890, Fifth Avenue between 51st and 91st Streets was mostly empty lots, modest row houses, and a few institutional buildings. By 1915, it was lined with mansions. Block after block of limestone and marble palaces, each one trying to outdo its neighbours, each one proving that its owners had arrived. Historians call this stretch Millionaire's Row, and at its peak it was the most concentrated display of wealth in American history. More ostentatious than Boston's Beacon Hill, more exclusive than Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square, more glamorous than Chicago's Gold Coast. This was where American aristocracy built its capital. And it all happened because one woman moved north to escape a hotel. But here's the irony Caroline couldn't have predicted. In leading society north, she also unleashed forces she couldn't control. The new Fifth Avenue wasn't like her old neighborhood. It wasn't quiet and restrained. It was competitive. It was flashy. It was about who could build the biggest house, throw the most expensive party, buy the most important art collection. The Vanderbilt Chateau had a ballroom that could hold 1,200 people, 3 times the capacity of Caroline's. William K. Vanderbilt's wife, Alva, threw a costume ball in 1883 that cost $250,000, roughly $7.5 million in today's money. One party, one night. This wasn't the old New York Caroline had defended. This was a new Gilded Age. Bigger, brasher, less concerned with lineage and more concerned with spectacle. And Caroline, in her 70s by the turn of the century, found herself presiding over a world she'd created but no longer fully controlled. She was still the Mrs. Astor. People still deferred to her. But the rules were changing, and she was too old, too tired, too rooted in the past to change with them. While Mrs. Astor and her followers were building their palaces uptown, something fascinating was happening to the neighborhood she'd left behind. It was disappearing. Not slowly, not gradually, but with shocking speed. The residential Fifth Avenue below 51st Street was being replaced by commerce, by stores, by offices, by hotels. The Waldorf Astoria, the hotel that had driven Caroline away, became even more successful after her departure. In 1897, John Jacob Astor IV built the Astoria Hotel right next door, and the two buildings merged into one massive complex with over 1,000 rooms. It became the place to see and be seen, not in private ballrooms, but in public spaces. The Waldorf Astoria's restaurants and lobbies became the new center of New York's social life. You didn't need an invitation to Mrs. Astor's ball anymore. You just needed money to buy a table at the Waldorf's Palm Garden. It was democratization, or at least the Gilded Age version of it. Around Caroline's old mansion at 34th Street, the transformation was even more dramatic. Department stores moved in. B. Altman and Company built a massive store at 34th and 5th in 1906, right where wealthy families had lived just a decade earlier. Lord and Taylor, Best and Company, Arnold Constable, all the great retail names of the era opened flagship stores along Fifth Avenue. The street that had been Caroline's home became New York's premier shopping destination. The Ladies' Mile shopping district, which had been a few blocks west, essentially moved east to consume Fifth Avenue. Office buildings rose, banks, insurance companies, publishers. The neighborhood that had been defined by private wealth became defined by corporate wealth. And then, in 1931, came the final transformation, the Empire State Building. Think about this sequence of events. In 1890, the site was occupied by Caroline Astor's brownstone, a private home for one of the most exclusive families in America. By 1893, it was occupied by the Waldorf Hotel, a semi-public space for wealthy travelers and society figures. By 1929, the hotel was demolished to make way for the Empire State Building, a commercial office tower designed to be the tallest building in the world. From exclusive private residence to semi-exclusive hotel to completely public skyscraper in less than 40 years. That's not just rapid change, that's transformation at a speed that would have been unimaginable to Caroline when she lived there. The same pattern repeated up and down Fifth Avenue below 51st Street. Mansions demolished, stores and offices built, the residential character completely erased. By 1920, you could walk down Fifth Avenue from Washington Square Park to 51st Street and not see a single private home. It was all commercial, all modern, all about money and movement and progress. The old New York, the New York of quiet brownstones and private balls and people who'd known each other's families for 3 generations, was gone. And Caroline had watched it happen from her palace at 65th Street, 30 blocks away, but increasingly irrelevant to the city's economic and cultural life. As the neighborhood changed, so did society. The 400, that magical list that had defined social power for 2 decades, became a joke. By 1900, newspapers were publishing parody versions of the list. The 400 millionaires, the 400 nobodies. The exclusivity that had seemed so powerful in 1890 seemed increasingly absurd in the new century. Why? Because American society was changing faster than Caroline could control. The progressive era was beginning. Reformers were attacking the excesses of the Gilded Age. Muckraking journalists were exposing the brutality behind industrial fortunes. Labor unions were organizing. The idea that a small group of families should control social power because of their lineage was starting to seem undemocratic, un-American. New money was flooding into New York, not from real estate or railroads, the old industries, but from new industries, automobiles, steel, oil, film. These new fortunes had no connection to the old Dutch families Caroline represented, and they didn't care about her approval. When Henry Ford became rich, do you think he cared whether Mrs. Astor would receive him? When the Hollywood studios started making millionaires, do you think they were worried about making the 400 list? No. They built their own social worlds. They created their own rules. They moved to California or Detroit or Texas and created new centers of power. Even among the old guard, things were changing. The younger generation, Caroline's own grandchildren, were more interested in Paris than New York. They were marrying European nobility. They were spending their time on yachts and in resorts, not in stuffy Fifth Avenue ballrooms. Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who'd thrown that famous costume ball, divorced her husband in 1895, scandalizing society, but also proving that the old rules could be broken. She remarried, moved to Paris, became a suffragette. The idea that women should spend their lives hosting balls and enforcing social hierarchies, that started to seem outdated. Ward McAllister died in 1895, the same year Caroline moved into her new mansion. His successor? There wasn't one. No one could replace him because no one wanted to. The role of social arbiter was disappearing. And Caroline? Caroline was getting old. By 1900, she was 70, still hosting her January ball, still receiving guests in her drawing room, still signing her notes, Mrs. Astor, without need for clarification. But she was increasingly a relic, a living museum. People came to her balls not because they needed her approval, but because they wanted to say they'd attended a ball at Mrs. Astor's house while she was still alive. It was respect tinged with nostalgia, deference tinged with pity. The Queen was still on her throne, but the kingdom was crumbling around her. And in 1908, the reign finally ended. The last years of Caroline Astor's life were marked by silence. Not the comfortable silence of old age, but the painful silence of a woman watching her world dissolve. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., had died in 1892, before the move to 65th Street, before the feud with William Waldorf escalated, before the new mansion was even designed. She'd been a widow for over 15 years. Her children were scattered, some married and living their own lives, some struggling with scandals or disappointments. The Astor family, like many dynasties, produced as many failures as successes. And her health was failing. By 1905, Caroline was 75 years old, still hosting the annual January ball, but with less energy. Still receiving guests, but more briefly. Her appearances in public became rarer. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly forgetful, repeating stories, confusing faces. The sharp, commanding woman who'd ruled society for 40 years was fading into something more fragile. There's a particularly poignant story from her final years. She would reportedly hold conversations with guests who weren't there, people from her past, long dead, summoned by memory or confusion. Her servants would play along, not wanting to disturb her. She was, in effect, living in the past. Which was perhaps fitting, because the past was the only place where she still had absolute power. The January ball of 1908 was her last. By this point, it wasn't really the social event of the season anymore. There were competitors, younger hostesses, more extravagant parties. But people still came, partly out of respect, partly out of curiosity, and partly because attending Mrs. Astor's ball had become a tradition, and traditions die hard. Caroline appeared, as always, in dark silk with her diamonds. But guests noted she seemed tired, distracted. The fire that had made her so formidable was guttering. By October 1908, she was bedridden. Heart failure, most likely, though the obituaries were vague about specifics. Gilded Age families didn't discuss illness publicly. On October 30th, 1908, Caroline Webster Schermerhorn Astor died in her bedroom at 840 Fifth Avenue. She was 78 years old. The funeral was everything you'd expect: massive, formal, elaborate. Trinity Church overflowed with mourners. The service featured music by Mendelssohn and Chopin. The obituaries in every major newspaper ran for columns, recounting her life, her reign, her influence. "The Mrs. Astor is dead," wrote the New York Times. Not Mrs. William Astor or Caroline Astor, just the Mrs. Astor, as if there could be no other. And in a way, there couldn't. The role she'd created, social arbiter, guardian of taste, keeper of the gates, died with her. Her children didn't inherit her authority. Her grandchildren didn't want it. The era of Mrs. Astor ended on October 30th, 1908. But the mansion she'd built, that stood for nearly 20 more years, outliving its purpose, waiting for its own end. After Caroline's death, the mansion at 840 Fifth Avenue became a problem. It was too big for any single person to live in comfortably. It was expensive to maintain. The heating bills alone were staggering. And it represented a way of life that was already slipping into history. Caroline's son, John Jacob Astor IV, inherited the house. But he didn't live in it. Why would he? He had other homes. a mansion at 65th Street and Madison Avenue, an estate in Newport. He spent much of his time traveling. The 840 Fifth Avenue mansion sat mostly empty, occasionally opened for family gatherings, otherwise shuttered and maintained by a skeleton staff of caretakers. And then, in 1912, John Jacob Astor IV died on the Titanic. Yes, that Titanic. John Jacob Astor IV was one of the wealthiest passengers aboard. He was traveling back from his honeymoon with his second wife, a marriage that had scandalized society because she was decades younger than him. When the ship sank, he helped his pregnant wife into a lifeboat and then went down with the ship. His body was recovered days later, identified by the initials on his clothing. The richest man on the Titanic, gone. And with him, any real hope that the Fifth Avenue mansion would continue as a family home. His son, Vincent Astor, inherited everything. But Vincent had no interest in living in his grandmother's chateau. He was a modern man, interested in yachts, aviation, business. The idea of hosting formal balls and maintaining a 40-room mansion, that belonged to his grandmother's generation, not his. For over a decade, the mansion sat, partially occupied by family members occasionally, otherwise empty. A ghost ship on dry land. The neighborhood around it was changing too. By the 1920s, even Fifth Avenue in the 60s and 70s was feeling pressure from development. Apartment buildings were starting to rise. The era of single-family mansions in Manhattan was ending. They simply took up too much valuable real estate. The economic logic was inescapable. A mansion might house one family, but an apartment building on the same plot could house 50 families, all paying rent. The math made the decision obvious. In 1925, Vincent Astor made his decision. He would sell the mansion, not to another family. There weren't any families left who wanted houses like this, but to developers who would tear it down and build something modern, something that made economic sense. The sale was quiet, no big announcement, just a real estate transaction. The mansion that Caroline had built as a monument to permanence would be demolished after just 30 years. Think about that. 30 years. Less than one human lifetime. Built in 1895, gone by 1926. Before the demolition began, there was an auction. Everything inside the house, the furniture, the paintings, the tapestries, the chandeliers, the doorknobs, was catalogued and sold. The auction catalogue itself is a fascinating document. Hundreds of lots, French antiques, Italian marble, gilded mirrors, Persian rugs. Each item carefully described, each one carrying the provenance from the estate of Mrs. William Astor. That provenance added value. People wanted to own something that had belonged to the Mrs. Astor, even if they'd never met her, even if her social power meant nothing in 1925. The mystique persisted. The auction was a success. Rich collectors bought pieces that are now scattered in museums and private collections around the world. Parts of Mrs. Astor's world fragmented and dispersed. And then came the wrecking crews. The demolition of a Gilded Age mansion was brutal work. These houses weren't built with modern materials that could be easily dismantled. They were built with limestone blocks, marble slabs, iron beams, plaster walls 2 feet thick. The workers used sledgehammers, crowbars, eventually dynamite. They stripped the roof, smashed the windows, tore out the floors. Reduced Hunt's carefully designed chateau to rubble. There's a photograph from the demolition. I don't know if you can find it easily, but it circulated in newspapers at the time, showing children playing in one of the upstairs bathrooms while the house was being torn down around them. The walls were already gone. The ceiling was exposed to the sky. But the bathtub was still there, absurdly intact, and neighborhood kids had climbed up to play in the ruins. It's a haunting image. The most exclusive home in New York, built to keep people out, now a playground for anyone who wanted to climb the rubble. By 1926, the house was gone, completely. Nothing left but a vacant lot and a pile of broken limestone that would eventually be hauled away or crushed for fill. And in its place, Temple Emanu-El, a synagogue, one of the largest, most beautiful synagogues in America, built in a Romanesque Byzantine style with soaring arches and brilliant mosaics. Designed by the firm of Cohn, Butler and Stein, completed in 1930, still standing today. The site where Mrs. Astor had hosted the 400, the most exclusive social club in America, which had excluded Jewish families, was now home to one of the most prominent Jewish congregations in the world. The irony was so perfect it barely needs commentary. While Temple Emanu-El was rising at 65th Street, another transformation was happening 30 blocks south. Remember the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, the building that had started this whole story? The hotel that William Waldorf Astor built to drive Caroline away. By the 1920s, it was obsolete. Not because it wasn't successful, it was wildly successful. But because the neighborhood had changed. Manhattan was building up, not out. And a 13-story hotel, no matter how luxurious, was wasting prime real estate. In 1929, the hotel was sold and demolished. In its place, the developers planned something audacious, the tallest building in the world. The Empire State Building. Construction began in 1930, right in the middle of the Great Depression. It was built in just 18 months, an astonishing feat of engineering and organization. When it opened in 1931, it was 102 stories tall, 1,454 feet including the antenna. An Art Deco masterpiece that would remain the world's tallest building for 40 years. And it stood on the exact spot where Caroline Astor had lived from 1850 to 1895. From brownstone mansion to luxury hotel to world's tallest building in 40 years. That's not just change, that's obliteration of the past. Today, if you stand on the observation deck of the Empire State Building and look north up Fifth Avenue, you can see Temple Emanu-El at 65th Street. Just a speck in the distance, but visible. One building on the site of Caroline's first home, another on the site of her second. Both monuments to forces she tried her entire life to resist. Commercialization, democratization, and demographic change. The Astor family, which had made its fortune in real estate, was now commemorated by buildings they didn't own, on land they'd sold, serving purposes they'd never intended. The Waldorf Astoria didn't disappear completely, of course. In 1931, the hotel reopened in a new location, Park Avenue and 49th Street. A massive Art Deco tower, 47 stories tall. even more luxurious than the original, even more exclusive. But different, fundamentally different. The old Waldorf Astoria had been horizontal, a sprawling complex of connected buildings. The new Waldorf Astoria was vertical, a tower piercing the sky. The old Waldorf had been about replacing private homes with semi-public spaces. The new Waldorf was about efficiency, density, modernity. And here's the fascinating part. The new hotel was immediately successful. Even in the depths of the Great Depression, wealthy people still traveled, still needed places to stay, still wanted luxury. What didn't survive was Caroline's model. The idea that social power came from exclusion, from private balls in private homes, from knowing who was in and who was out. The new luxury was public. Anyone with money could stay at the Waldorf. Anyone with money could dine in its restaurants. You didn't need Caroline's approval, you just needed a wallet. That was the future. And it had no room for queens who determined who mattered. So what do we learn from Caroline Astor's story? On one level, it's about the impermanence of power. Caroline was the most powerful woman in New York for 30 years. She determined who mattered. And within 20 years of her death, her world was gone. Her mansions demolished, her rules forgotten, her exclusions irrelevant. But I think there's something deeper here. Caroline's tragedy wasn't that she lost power, it's that she never understood what her power really was. She thought her power came from her lineage, from her place in the Astor dynasty, from her ability to exclude people and enforce rules. But actually, her power came from timing. She rose to dominance in the 1870s and 1880s, exactly the moment when American industrial wealth was exploding but hadn't yet developed its own social structures. The Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, they were making fortunes, but they didn't know how to act like aristocrats. They needed someone to teach them, to create rules, to give their wealth legitimacy. Caroline provided that. She was the bridge between old New York and new money. She turned railroad fortunes and steel profits into something that looked like European nobility. But once that bridge was built, she became unnecessary. The new rich didn't need her approval anymore. They had their own mansions, their own social circles, their own rules. And more fundamentally, America was changing. The progressive era was questioning whether inherited wealth should matter, whether social hierarchies based on birth made sense in a democracy, whether concentration of power in a few families was compatible with American ideals. Caroline couldn't survive those questions, because her entire existence was premised on ideas those questions challenged. The nephew who started this war, William Waldorf Astor, he understood something Caroline didn't. He understood that the future belonged to commerce, not lineage, to hotels, not houses, to public spaces, not private balls. He forced Caroline to move. But more than that, he forced her into irrelevance. Because by building a hotel, he proved that you could monetize social space. You could sell what Caroline tried to control. And once something can be sold, it can't remain exclusive. Both of Caroline's mansions are gone, but their replacements tell a story. The Empire State Building, commerce, height, modernity, democracy. Anyone can buy a ticket to the observation deck. Temple Emanu-El, a beautiful building, yes, but also a symbol of the communities Caroline excluded. The Jewish families who couldn't get on the 400 list now worship on the exact spot where she hosted her balls. There's poetic justice in that, maybe even divine justice, if you're inclined to see it that way. The war Caroline Astor fought was a war against time, against change, against the relentless march of modernity. And like every person who's ever fought that war, she lost. But in losing, she left us something valuable, a window into a world that no longer exists, a world where social power was concentrated in the hands of a few families who controlled access through sheer force of personality and tradition. We don't live in that world anymore, and mostly that's a good thing. But there's something almost tragic about Caroline. She built so carefully, she controlled so completely, she created a system that felt permanent. And within 30 years of her death, it was all gone. Demolished, replaced, forgotten by everyone except historians and documentary filmmakers digging through archives trying to reconstruct a ghost. Today, if you walk down Fifth Avenue, past the Empire State Building, up to Central Park, past Temple Emanu-El, you're walking through a living museum of change. Every block tells a story of what was lost and what replaced it. Brownstones becoming department stores, mansions becoming museums, entire worlds dissolving into new ones. And somewhere in that progression, there's Caroline Astor, the Mrs. Astor. Stubborn, powerful, ultimately mortal. A woman who thought she could stop time by building a chateau and closing her doors. A woman who discovered that time doesn't negotiate. A woman whose stubbornness started a war and accidentally reshaped an entire city. The mansions are gone, the balls are finished, the 400 list is a curiosity. But Fifth Avenue remains, changed, transformed, unrecognizable to Caroline. And in that transformation, there's a lesson. Cities belong to the living, not the dead. To commerce, not to memory. To the future, not the past. Caroline Astor tried to build a dynasty that would last forever. Instead, she built a story, a ghost, a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the inevitability of change. And perhaps, in the end, that's a more lasting legacy than any mansion could ever be.